Welcome to the second episode of Beyond Unsolved. And tonight we are talking about the Netflix documentary called Surviving Death. You might hear my toddler come and bang on the door because it's almost bedtime and she knows I'm in here. So my husband will be putting her to bed. But this documentary I saw about a year ago and wanted to talk about it, never did. Recently rewatched it all but a couple episodes because those weren't my favorite episodes, but I did make notes on everything. It's a docuseries and it's done in 6 parts. So there's different subjects for each episode. And overall, it's one of I was never a huge documentary watcher. I've seen some and I really like them. And when I watch them, I wonder why I don't watch more. It's one of the best docuseries. I was going to say documentaries, but it's in multiple parts. It's one of the best that I've ever seen because it's subject matter that I am so interested in and have been my whole life. And Beyond Unsolved, this docuseries reminds me of segments that would come straight out of an Unsolved Mysteries episode, because it's the ultimate unsolved mystery. Life after death, reincarnation, and it was just right up my alley. So I knew that it needed to be an episode. Why not the second episode? So the very first episode talks about near-death experiences. And what struck me about this episode is the first person that they talk to is somebody who experienced a near-death experience, but a medical doctor who experienced a near-death experience. And this, I think, in a lot of people's minds would give it more validity just because she's a scientist and wouldn't normally be inclined to believe something like this unless it happened to her. So she was kayaking, was it Chile? In Chile? She was in another country. She wasn't in the US. And she drowned. And she talked about her soul being taken away from her body and greeted by beings that were important to her life. So she said that she saw flowers and colors everywhere. And there was a weird passage of time all at once, but had some structure. She felt like she was at home and could still feel that her body was submerged underwater back, where she came from. So she was kayaking with a group of people and they found where she went under, but they were having a hard time getting to her until one person found one of her belongings. It might have been her life jacket, and then felt her body hit his leg underwater. And he grabs her out. She's bloated and purple, and they try to perform CPR on her. And she says that at this time she watched from the entrance to a dome structure as they gave her CPR, and that she didn't want to go back to her body. And she felt comforted and reassured to stay at the dome, but the beings told her that it wasn't her time. And I got goosebumps a lot throughout this series and in this particular part. When she came back, she was beaten up really badly by the river and was in horrible shape. So this was in Chile. So she says, I want to say that this might have happened in the 90s or early 2000s or something. But they got her to a road and they just happened to come upon an ambulance. And she said that this was so remote and such a crazy thing because they were out in the middle of nowhere. So how do you, in desperate need of an ambulance, happen upon one right when you need it the most? But she did. So her husband was told that she wouldn't survive, or if she did, she would have brain damage. But she went on to make a complete recovery. And I'm getting goosebumps again. The documentary is so well done. The stories are so compelling. They will just move you to tears. I saw a picture of her with her 4 young kids, and it got this feeling of happiness from it, that her kids were so happy that they didn't lose their mom, because it's a picture of them after she's made her recovery. So she goes on to talk about how people in her line of work, like her colleagues, like they wouldn't believe this kind of thing, but she now believes based off of what she went through. So we go on to see this division of perceptual studies that studies mediums, near-death experiences, reincarnation, deathbed visions for 50 years. They've recorded near-death experience since the 1800s. And by, I think one of the first experiences was by a man who fell off the Alps. He found 30 other similar cases, and to the doctor, I think, to what she experienced. In the 60s and 70s, when resuscitation became more prevalent, more near-death experience came about. They became more prevalent. They go on to reference a book called Life After Life, and I immediately downloaded it on Audible. I haven't listened to it yet, but it's there. But in that book, it talks about so many similar themes and experiences, about people coming back profoundly changed. There is a Seattle Association for Near-Death Studies, which is kind of cool because I'm currently in the Seattle area. I'm in the suburbs, but we're actually going to be moving to Nashville in a few months, so I won't be in Seattle long. But when I saw this documentary, I had no idea that this existed and thought it was very cool. So they study near-death experiences, and they say that near-death experiences typically happen without drugs being given at the time of death. Because, people like to figure out why these things happen. They feel like there's an excuse. There's always an explanation. But there's a doctor in the documentary that explains when there's a lack of oxygen to the brain, people typically have terrified or belligerent reactions or things that they see or experience, which is the opposite of most near-death experiences. And I'm getting goosebumps again because a lot of times in near-death experiences, you hear people talk about a light, a tunnel, a feeling of calmness, seeing, people talk about being greeted by family members that have passed on before them. There are very, very common themes, but sometimes you hear about people who essentially, here go the goosebumps, they essentially have visions of a dark place, of what to you or I might sound like hell. And by the way, I'm not a religious person. I don't have a belief in heaven or hell. I don't have a disbelief. I don't know anything to be true. I don't have a certainty about anything, but I'm open to everything and I'm interested in hearing about it all. But those experiences seem to be less common and are very interesting to me because, a lot of people seem to have more common experiences, and these sound terrifying. When people experience the opposite of the white light and the tunnel and the calmness and not wanting to come back, I feel like there was, I don't know if there was one in this documentary. I guess not. Or maybe I saw it in another documentary about people explaining the horrible things that they saw in near-death experiences. And actually, I should Google and just like look for these and find more stories, because those, since they're less common, are even more fascinating to me. So they go on to talk more about trying to explain near-death experiences. So when somebody flatlines, there's no brain activity. So the doctors say that they couldn't have. Hey, baby, good night. Night-night, baby. Mama. So they say they couldn't have visions or watch their own surgeries, or see what is happening to their body. So that's another thing too that's really common. So when somebody is in surgery being worked on, if they have a near-death experience while that's happening, some people come back and say, I was hovering above my body and I saw them doing this or that. Like in the documentary, they talk about a woman who, that's the next one. That's the next story, I think. And so if they come back through, at some point their brain resumes. So, okay, I think I asked this question to myself. So if they come back through, at some point their brain resumes. So how can you say it couldn't have been a dream or illusion? See, I'm obviously not a medical doctor, and in the documentary, they're talking to medical professionals and they're trying to say why they think that with the way that the body is and what happens during clinical death, that they couldn't have had these visions. But I'm thinking, well, when they're coming back, couldn't that have been when they had these visions? And couldn't that just be a result of their brain kind of regaining itself? I don't know. You know what? Okay. Again, I don't know for sure. And the thing about it is I don't want to discount anybody's experience, because I've not gone through it. And I imagine that people who experience this, to them, it feels very real. And especially the people that are like saying that they're hovering above their bodies and they're watching this operation and they're telling doctors about instruments they saw them use and about like a blow by blow of what the surgery was, like what they did, things that they couldn't know. That is especially hard to explain away. So I don't want to discount anything that anybody goes through to say, oh, well, there's got to be an explanation. It had to have been a hallucination. It had to have been a dream when they were coming back to life. But I don't know any of that to be true. And in fact, this might be a good next episode for me. So I didn't have a near-death experience, but I have had some really weird experiences for all of my 20s. And I'm telling you, it started right when I was 20 years old, right around when I turned 30. Like I had some kind of light experiences after that, but really largely what I went through stopped around 30. And I just think that's very weird. So at around 20, I started seeing things like as I was going to sleep or as I was waking up from sleep. And when I Googled it, I was trying to figure out what was going on with me, because it was scary, for one thing. Felt very real and didn't feel like a dream to me. So I would see people or like a dark mass or hear things as I was going to sleep or waking up, and that's called hypnagogia or hypnopompic visions or auditory hallucinations, and it's at the onset of sleep or coming out of sleep. And from what I understand, there it's very rare. I think more common things you hear about are night terrors, which that kind of sounds like a night terror to me, but like sleep paralysis, which I've never experienced sleep paralysis. I don't know if what I experienced could be a subset of that, or it's probably related, but I've never been paralyzed coming out of sleep. My mom has. My mom has once. And she talked about how terrifying it was. And luckily she wasn't alone. My dad was there. But, she said that she, couldn't scream. Like, she was making muffled sounds. And my dad was like, he comes back into the room. I think he was in the bathroom. And he's like, are you okay? And then suddenly she was released. And she was, terrified. And told him what happened. But I've never had that. But for a decade, I had instances where I would wake up and be screaming because I thought someone had broken into my house and was standing over me watching me sleep. And it was so real, and I can still see in my mind what I saw then. It's like burned into my memory. And I think that might be a good third episode for this because it's a personal experience. It's very relevant. And I thought my cat was pooping in the room. I didn't know what was happening. I think that could be a really good third episode. My family has heard about it for years. And I think that it would be a really good subject, and I would be really interested to know if there are people out there that have experienced the same thing, because I'm glad that it doesn't still happen to me anymore. But because I have a kid that sleeps with us in the bed, and waking up screaming would not be good. But yeah, definitely that's going to be my third episode, I think. So the next story, I don't know if my cat needs to go to the bathroom or not. You need to go to the bathroom? What are you doing? Are you interrupting me? The next story in the same episode comes from a woman who had an issue with her placenta. And the issue could potentially kill her or the baby. So she was having premonitions that she would die from this issue with her placenta and that the baby would survive. And this was after she Googled it. And she became convinced that she was going to die. This was going to happen to her. And throughout her pregnancy, as she got closer and closer to giving birth, she was absolutely certain she was going to die. And she was having premonitions constantly about it. So when she goes into labor, her baby survives. She has a C-section. But she flatlines, just as she predicted. And she says, here go the goosebumps again. I said, here go the goosebumps again. She could see everything in the operating room as they were working on her. She could also see her daughter, who was another part of the hospital with her nanny. and what her husband was wearing coming off the plane. So at the time, her husband was on a business trip, and he was in a different state, and she was able to see what he was wearing from there. So she could not only see what was happening in the room that she was in, but she could see her husband, who wasn't in the same state. So it turned out she had an amniotic aneurysm, and she was clinically dead for 37 seconds. She says that she heard everything a doctor said as the doctor was working on her, and when asked, that doctor confirmed that everything she heard was true. She did say those things while she was unconscious, while the patient was unconscious. And the doctors say there's no way to explain what she experienced medically. And that's what's so interesting is these doctors, because later we're going to hear from a hospice doctor in the last episode of this documentary series. And while, I'm sure that there are plenty of doctors who are religious. They can be scientists, but they can also have religion in their life. A lot of doctors, though, when you hear them interviewed in documentaries like this, will say that they wouldn't normally believe in this kind of thing unless they experienced it firsthand themselves. And when they experience it, it's just unexplainable. It's just one of those things. But in their field, the longer they're going and the more they're exposed to near death, or when people are in the process of dying, the more they just come to accept it. Like the proof just builds and builds, and they can't deny it. So that is very interesting. There was a survivor in the documentaries who, after he was clinically dead, when he came back, he started doing colorful art to show what he saw. At the end of the first episode, we go back to the doctor from the beginning. When she was dead, she said that beings told her that her son was going to die. She had 4 kids. I don't know if she knew which son. I don't know if she had multiple sons. But she never told anyone until just before his 18th birthday. Because I think that she assumed that he was going to die before or on his 18th birthday. And so she relaxed after he turned 18 because she thought, okay, maybe this isn't going to happen. But then 2 years later, he got hit by a car and died instantly. And this experience helped her believe even more in her near-death experience. And it helped her believe that there is life after death, that this isn't all there is. So she has some peace to know that she'll see her son again. And that is the end of the first episode. So the episodes that I didn't really care for were the ones on mediums. I did not see anything on mediums in this documentary, nor have I seen anything else anywhere that convinces me that mediums are real. I just don't. I'm not saying for sure that every one of them fakes it somehow, but I don't find them to be as interesting because there are a lot of people that call themselves mediums and they're cons. But I guess like anything else, I can't say for certain that mediums aren't real, that they're not being truthful and they're not really experiencing anything. But so in the medium episode, there's 2 of them. The first one, we see a medium from Ireland who has seen dead people from the age of 4, and they're doing a reading in a room full of people. Okay, and then there's a skeptic in the room that they talk to, and then he has a medium come to his home so that he can test if mediums are real. So she addresses what he said to his dad to mention. She addresses what he said for his dad to mention if he can really communicate to him through a medium. And then another medium's story about her backstory. When she was 11, she knew her grandpa was going to die. So she was able to, this was a premonition for her. And these 2 episodes are not. My cat is back there on her back, and it is hilarious. She's just chilling on her back. I'm yawning because it's 10:30 at night. Yes. The 2 episodes about mediums, I didn't go back and rewatch because, like I said, they weren't super interesting to me. So I'm going off of notes from the first time that I saw this. They then go to a parapsychology society for psychical research, which is the oldest scientific institution of parapsychology, established in 1882. And it was established by Cambridge academics and mediums. Previous members include Marie Curie and Mark Twain, which was interesting. So at this point in this episode, they're going to have a seance, and they talk about physical versus mental mediumship. Physical medium talks about her childhood of seeing a young girl in her room that said that she had been buried, and the medium found the girl's grave. A doctor goes through a medium to try to heal a man. They talk about ectoplasm. Leaving your body is painful. If light comes in and touches ectoplasm, it will shoot back into the body and cause internal bleeding and bruising. And it can also turn into a loved one. And then apparently the Society for Psychical Research calls bullshit on that. Episode 3, which is part 2 of the medium subject, a spirit guide talks through the physical medium. They start singing, and Tommy, with a high-pitched voice, comes through and says he's in charge of the ectoplasm. Frida is the next one, who is soft-spoken and speaks to a guy in attendance about his dad and tells him to let go of his burden. Super generic. He said he could feel someone standing in front of him. There's a guy who is crying. And at that point, I felt like if these mediums aren't real, they're taking advantage of grieving people, and that is so wrong to do. There is an Institute for Metaphysics, or International Institute for Metaphysics, in France, and they test if paranormal phenomena can occur under controlled conditions. There is next up a story of molds of hands and feet produced by a medium during a session. A Nobel Prize winner in physiology, the director of this institute, and an astronomer said that apparitions appeared and plunged into a water container filled with wax and produced these hands and feet. The experiment accounted for any possible fraud. These were children's hands, and all were grown men in attendance. So unless all the scholars decided to go in on the fraud, this was said to be real. And seeing the family members that were speaking to these mediums who claimed to be in contact with their dead family members, it's so sad to see how emotional they got, especially if it's not real. Like, that's just crushing, you know? So then they talk about trance versus physical mediumship difference. No physical ectoplasm, so you can have light. No physical manifestations. People talk through mediums in crazy voices. A super low voice at first, and then a really high-pitched boyish voice called Tommy. So they're, in the documentary, they're showing voices coming through this medium. They can be super low-pitched, or if it's a child's voice, then the medium gets this super high-pitched voice to sound like a child. There is a guy who is super into consistently going into mediums to talk to his dad that died suddenly. And you can see the desperation in his face, and it's so sad to see. He always asked the dead family members to give him a code word. He asked for to make sure that it's real. He said everything in this particular session could be found on Facebook. So there's a woman who lost her daughter to drugs 2 years prior, a family friend of the one enthusiastic guy. She talks about not wanting to get out of bed after losing her daughter, which, oh my God, like if I lost my kid, man, my heart goes out to people like that go through that, because you would just lose all will to live. I mean, you push through, you're a shell of a person, you're just getting through the day. You have nothing left to live for. Ma'am, would you like to be a part of the podcast? No, you may not. Although they do say cats can see ghosts, so I wonder if she could tell us like some of the things that she's seen in her. How old? She's like 14 years old now. So the psychic is telling her all the right things about her daughter, and she's crying during all of this, and her desperation is absolutely heartbreaking to me. Her desperation to hear from her daughter, to know where her daughter is, to know that her daughter is okay. And then they're talking about how there are signs all around from dead loved ones. And that brings us into episode 4 called Signs from the Dead. So when people talk about getting signs from loved ones, there are some common themes that a lot of people seem to experience, from lights flickering, electrical devices malfunctioning, nature, such as birds and butterflies. My grandmother passed away this past August, and my mom says that she sees cardinals in her dreams that she feels like are signs from my grandma, and she has been seeing cardinals out in her yard. I think she said she saw a white one, which I think that those are kind of rare. So the next story is about a woman who died at 97 and said she wanted to go to heaven, but that she didn't want to leave her daughters. And her daughter asked if she'd send a cardinal to let her know that she was okay. And the particular area of the country that they lived, the cardinals weren't a bird that it was around. And one day, a cardinal flew into her window and stunned itself. So when it came back to, the bird let them hold it. And then when they tried to let it fly free, it flew back. So they believe that that bird was a sign from their mom. They talk about after-death contact, or ADC. So ADC, I almost said ACD. See, ADC, after-death contact, visual apparition, auditory, which is hearing someone's voice, a person's smell, such as tobacco or perfume, or a feeling of physical contact. And the subject of, are we really seeing these signs, or do we assign meanings to things because we're looking for it? That's the subject that came up. Then there's a father in another story that started talking about hearing his dead son's voice. And he was writing down what his son was saying. And then he painted a beautiful pink and orange painting that shows the light of a young person passing. Next, we are taken to the Love Knows No Grief. The Love Knows No Death Grieve Retreat. There are a lot of people in attendance, and they're all sharing their stories. Parents who lost children. Those are particularly hard for me to listen to, being a mom. People who lost spouses. They get so sad when they're at these readings and their loved one doesn't come through publicly. So they sit and they listen to other people seemingly being able to visit with their loved one. But they're not, for whatever reason, their loved one doesn't come through in the session. There's one story of a couple who lost their son in a freak Boy Scout accident where a tree fell on a tent where 3 boys were, they were taking cover in a storm. I think they were in a tent, but a tree fell on them, and 2 of the boys were able to escape. Yeah, they were in a tent. But this boy who died was crushed under the weight of the tree, so he couldn't breathe, so he suffocated. This family, when you watch this documentary, this family, you could see and feel the grief coming off of them. Their turmoil was intense. And this was one of the parts in the documentary where I cried because, your heart goes out to them having experienced something like that. And they had 2 other children that they had to continue to live on for. And how hard that must be to have to deal with the grief of losing a kid. And then you have other kids that are still here, and how do you stay present for them and not fall apart and just I don't know, that has to be so hard. They talk about how for a long time they were looking for signs that their son was okay or continued to exist in another plane of existence, and they weren't getting that for a while until they finally did. So the mom says that she was standing at her kitchen counter and she smelled her son. And if you're a parent, and I think particularly a mother, because you know, if you have a biological child, you carry that child, you birth that child, you're with them every day. There is such a level to that is almost like they don't have words. It's this connection that's not like any other. And so, there are days when Vivi will be sitting on my lap and I just I don't want to start crying, but I will be holding her really close, just hugging her and smelling her hair and trying to memorize her at 2.5, because before I know it, she's going to be 20 years old and an adult, and I will miss this time with her. And so to think of your kid being gone and you're just in your kitchen and you suddenly feel them move through you. There's a part in Poltergeist, Poltergeist from the 80s, not the remake, where they're looking for Carol Ann and the mom feels her move through her. And she says, I could smell her. She moved through my soul. And Jo Beth Williams, her performance there, again, especially if you're a parent, especially if you're a mom, that will bring you to tears. Because you can only imagine. So when she smelled her son, it was so distinct and so real to her. She ran upstairs to his room, and he was in his urn on his bed. And that is something, to each their own, and everybody grieves in different ways. Everybody needs something different when it comes to laying a loved one to rest. I don't know what I would rather for myself, be buried or be cremated. But I don't think that I could keep a loved one's ashes in my house. For some people, that would bring them comfort because it's like they've come home. And I personally just don't think that I would be okay with that, because I wouldn't want them in that way. I would probably just scatter their ashes somewhere beautiful that they wanted to be. But she thought that she might see him, but she only found his urn on his bed. But they talk about how they don't find comfort in religion, but in physics, because energy cannot be destroyed. And that's what let them be able to go on and continue to be there for their remaining 2 kids. And then that is the end of episode 4. And now we go into episode 5, which is called Seeing Dead People. Was this one of the ones? Yeah, this was the episode where I cried the most. They start off the episode by talking about ghosts and seeing dead people, parapsychology. If you're familiar with Ghostbusters, they were parapsychologists, or at least Venkman was one. The study of psychic phenomena. We see an adjunct parapsychologist and a medium ghost hunt. And they do the EVPs. And with these, I feel like, they'll listen back to recordings and they'll put meaning, or they'll be like, did you hear that? And then they'll say they heard this, but really it could be anything. And I just face planted into my microphone. Again, I don't put a lot of stock in these ghost investigations, not to rain on anybody's parade. It's all kind of cool in its own way, I guess. But I think that you can listen to these recordings and you can hear different things, And who really knows what it is? Because don't they use these, or they call ghost boxes, where they scan radio frequencies for ghosts to be able to pick out words to communicate. So I don't know. I don't put a lot of stock in those. So then they talk about someone named William James, who is a founder of psychic research, who lost a toddler as a child. They have stories about ghosts showing up in pictures. There is a guy, I think he's in California, and he has this haunted camera that in his house, I guess, the house he's in, I think, might have been the house that he grew up in, and then I think he owns it as an adult now. But he has this Polaroid camera that was given to him by his dad. And every time he would take a picture, he would see smoke. And he thought initially that it was the film in that camera. And so he got new film, and it continued to show up with smoke every time he would take a picture. I don't know. People can doctor pictures. People can, it's a cool story, I guess. He was very convinced that his house or the camera or both were haunted. At one point, he said that there was a ghost in his house that spelled out answers in smoke in each developed photo. So moving on from that, they talk about something called a crisis apparition. And this is seeing or hearing someone around the time of death. So this, I think, is very prevalent in hospice. And my dad's father, I don't call him grandpa. I never had a good relationship with him, so I just refer to him as my dad's father. He died, I think, of complications from type 1 diabetes. And my mom and dad were going to go visit him it turned out to be the night that he died. And they're in the room with him, and he goes, "Do you see that?" and he's looking at the wall. Like, I think he was like looking maybe towards like a soap dispenser on the wall. Let me see if my cat needs to get out. Okay, we're all alone now. Everything's still working. I've been talking for the longest time. It's going to be a long episode. Okay, so yeah, so my dad's father was like, do you see that? And they're like, my mom and dad were there, and they were like, no, what do you see? I don't think he ever said what he saw, because he was in really bad shape, and at points he had like this crazy looking mask on his face for oxygen, I guess, but they just said that he kept staring at something. And so they think, no, I think he said that it was like beautiful or something. Something was beautiful, and he was just staring at a wall. Or maybe he talked about a light. Anyway, whatever he was seeing, my mom and dad couldn't see because it was just a wall. And then after they visited with him, they left. And then he died soon after that. So that is what they say about these visions, is that once you start having them, death is near. But they can start months or weeks or days before. But as they become more prevalent, that can mean that death is imminent. My mom's mother, who I will call Grandma, she was a very nice lady. She started seeing people months before she died that she knew in life that had died a long time ago. And my grandma started having strokes a number of years ago. And each time it became harder for her to recover. And then this last stroke, when she went to the hospital, she kept having them and having, like, I think she had a heart attack. And they were like, she's, like, we should put her on hospice. And my mom has told me stories before about her seeing, because my mom has 2 brothers that have died. And she had talked about seeing them and it being so real to her. She thought they were there. And my mom's sister, who was my grandma's main caretaker when she got, when she was recovering from her stroke. And at some point, she couldn't take care of herself anymore. So my mom's sister, she talked about how one night my grandma pops up from sleeping and says, I gotta go. My dad's waiting for me, or somebody's here, or something. And her dad, or whoever this person was, had long been dead. And my mom's sister was like, no, they're not here. And she's like, yes, they are. And it was so real to her. And it's so sad, because it's like they're trapped in their mind, or they're somewhere else, like they're not with us while they're still with us physically, And I imagine it's got to be really scary for the person who's taking care of the one who's having these visions, because, like, I'm sure by now a lot of people are kind of familiar with this kind of thing when they're dealing with someone who's sick, that they can see these kinds of things and what it can mean. So this is the episode where we we hear from a hospice doctor. So he is somebody who is not religious. He's fine with relaying what he has seen, what he has experienced, but he doesn't like to say what he believes, because he's a medical doctor. He thinks that, I don't know, like, it would be frowned upon or something. But he actually is doing these studies on his patients, just interviewing them and the people that he works with, the nurses, the hospice nurses, and talking to them about what they experience and just collecting all this information. And there's another hospice doctor who is his partner who talks about what he experienced. But we'll get to that in a second. So this hospice doctor, he became a hospice doctor, the one I was just talking about, because his dad died when he was 12. And he believed that people working in the medical field didn't do a very good job talking to the loved ones left behind. They weren't comforting. And this is something that I think my mom experienced because she had a horrible experience where my grandmother was when she was at the hospital. My mom had a horrible experience. The staff didn't know how to talk to her. They were really not very nice to her, from what my mom said. And I think that is really important, like you've got to be able to sympathize and talk to these people who are losing their family members in a way that doesn't cause them more grief or trauma, because my mom is really traumatized from what she experienced. So from what I've learned and what I'd like to learn more about is that hospice superstition where the nurses who do more of the care part of hospice, the doctors come through and they will check on the patient, see how the progress is and where they are. But the nurses are the ones that are really there for them during longer stretches of time. And so they have all these superstitions. And they're the ones that have to really tell the doctors about what they see and get the doctors to pay attention. Because a lot of times the doctors don't pay attention to these things that are happening. And the things that their patients and the nurses are seeing. So when the hospice doctor is going around to these patients and interviewing them, it's so crazy that it's very interesting to me that they're willing to participate in this documentary while they're in end-of-life care. Personally, I feel like if it were me, I'd be like, do not put a camera in my face. I'm not happy to be at the end of my life. Like, I think I would probably be super bitter and not want a camera shoved in my face and to talk about, how I'm dying. These people that talk are just, they're just still living their lives, and they look like any other normal person, but they're just on hospice care. And so this doctor is trying to create proof with quantifiable methods in peer-reviewed journals so that these end-of-life experiences can be legitimized. He has found that over 80% of these sightings were when a patient was awake. So when they see loved ones, it wasn't like they saw them in a dream. They were fully awake and saw these things, saw these visions. In children who are in hospice, who don't know a person who has passed away before them, we'll often see pets who have passed. A school counselor's mom started seeing people walking around in her room 6 months before she died, and she knew all the people. And as I said, the frequency increases as death draws nearer. There is a second hospice doctor that I talked about before who was the first hospice doctor's partner, and his mom was in the very hospice where he worked. He had a brother who died at 3 from leukemia, and then his dad died when his mom was 50, I think he said, and his mother became bitter after losing her young son and her husband. But then when she was on hospice, there was a portrait of her 3-year-old son who died that was around. And she started talking to it. During the last year of her life, she talked to this portrait and became happy again. And that seems to be the common experience. When people who are at the end of their life, when they start seeing people who have died before them, they're often happy and comforted by these visions. And so they're not confused. And the doctors have found these people to be cognitively intact. So people who work in hospice fully believe that these people are seeing real things. Then we talked to another parent who's lost a child. Again, this was a 14-year-old kid who died from brain cancer. And she started talking to her aunt before she died. And this is the one where I just started sobbing. The bereaved are believed to be comforted by these visions as well. So the people, when the doctors talked about the people who were left behind, their family members that know about these visions, they're comforted too, because they are reassured that their family member that they're losing, that they will possibly be able to see them again in another life. So at the end of this episode, the hospice doctors asked if he believes in life after death. And like I said, he said that he doesn't like to answer this, but he thinks you'd be a fool to discount the evidence. Now moving on to the last episode, episode 6, which is on reincarnation. There is a woman's son named Atlas who said he was another boy in another life that had been murdered. This started at age 1.5 when he started having night terrors that last for hours and continued for years. That is one of the interesting things in this episode, is that when kids start seeing past lives, they're around 2 or 3. My daughter is 2.5, and I really hope she does not start talking about a past life where she was murdered, because that would be horrifying. And then I think around older elementary school age is kind of when these things sort of stop. When Atlas was 5, he started talking about his other mom, and that his name was Jalen Robinson, and his mom's last name was Washington. Atlas's mom Googled the names and found an obituary for a toddler murdered by his babysitter, and she found a picture of him. Jalen died in 2005, and Atlas was born in 2014. She found a man named Jim Tucker at the University of Virginia who studies these cases and has been studying reincarnation for 20 years. So Jim goes to Atlas's house with a series of pictures from Jalen's life, a playground he would have played on, his house, his mom, and he presents 2 photos at a time to Atlas and asks him to pick, which playground do you remember going? And he is very decisive. He seems very sure each time, he doesn't hesitate when he points out pictures. But the thing that I feel like, okay, the kid did pick 5 out of 5 correctly. So Jim showed 5 sets of pictures and the kid was 100%. However, if you think about it though, each time he has a 50% chance of being right. I would have been more impressed if he presented him with, say, a group of 5 photos and he picked the right one every time. Because then you have a 1 in 5 chance, right, of picking the right one. So I kind of feel like that's not as impressive to me, or like as much proof to me that, you know, he is this boy. He was this boy in a past life. So then we talk about the Division of Perceptual Studies, or DOPS for short, which is founded by Ian Stevenson. I had a book from him in 2006 that I like only read a few pages of that I really need to go back to. And I think I actually downloaded the audiobook version of that because I'm probably, if I'm being honest with myself, more likely to listen to the audiobook version than to actually sit down and read the book at this point. But his book is called, one of his books is called Old Souls. And it's his long study of kids in past lives. So Ian Stevenson was in psychology and he had an interest in parapsychology. And speaking of reincarnation, this is kind of interesting. So I have a lot of recurring dreams. And since I had a kid, I have, dreams that have to do with my kid. And I've had a couple dreams where Vivi will be there. Vivi's my daughter's name. But she's not my daughter. She's my sister. So I've had dreams that in other lives, she's been my sister and not my daughter. And it's so interesting that I would have those dreams. Like I said, I've had them a couple times. And I've said before that she's my soulmate. Like my husband's my soulmate. I think you can have multiple soulmates, but I definitely feel like my daughter's my soulmate. Like I feel most connected to her more than anybody else in the world. And that makes sense. I carried her, I'm with her every day. I know her inside and out, But to dream that our connection or our love is so strong that we've known each other in other lives, not just as mother and daughter, but as sisters. Like, how did my mind come up with that, Like, it's just so cool to think about. And, like, kind of just speaks to, like, how deeply you love somebody. But, I don't know. That is very, very cool. And then they go on to talk about how birthmarks or defects that can match ways that someone died. Reincarnation is more accepted in Asia, and there are more stories from there. Antonia Mills, who is a PhD from the University of Northern British Columbia, began studying these cases in 1984 and continued Ian Stevenson's work in Asia. A boy named Ryan Hammonds has the most verifiable information of a past life in Hollywood. Jim, who we talked about before, who studies these cases, met Ryan when he was 5. In the documentary, Ryan is 15. And in the documentary, in current day, Ryan doesn't seem to want to talk about any of this. And he doesn't have a lot of memory from the things that he experienced when he was a little kid. His mom said that he would cry every night and say that he just wanted to go home and see his mom and his kids. So this started with nightmares around 4 or 5 years old. He would grab his chest and say that he couldn't breathe. And Ryan's family was Christian, so they had a hard time in believing reincarnation. Ryan picked out a picture of an extra in an old Hollywood film called Marty Martin. And Ryan was able to pick out his wife from his old life. Jim reached out to Marty Martin's daughter to see how many personal statements that he could verify. And Ryan even knew details that his daughters didn't know until later they were verified. They verified over 50 statements. And it's not like, so this was before the internet. So he was an extra in Hollywood movies. So it's not like there was no information to easily find on him. Jim had to do a lot of work to find out who this person was and essentially had to interview his daughters to get the information. Nothing was available. If there was the internet, like it was kind of in the beginning of the internet where there, you couldn't really find much. And so it added to the validity that this family wasn't just crafting this story. They didn't just read about it somewhere. It wasn't easy. This information was not easily accessible. And they were able to verify 50 statements, things like colors of cars that he owned, the street that he lived on, things about family members that weren't famous. Well, he wasn't famous either. He was an extra. So Ryan and his mom go to meet Marty's daughter, and Ryan said that when he got there, he instantly felt at home in Los Angeles. So Jim often reconnects with adults that he worked with as kids. He talks about another kid named James who began having nightmares just like the other kids that he has studied. He'd lay on his back, kicking his hands and his feet as if he was in a box. And he said, "Airplane crash on fire, little man can't get out." And his parents, just as I would be, were horrified. He said his name was James. So his name was James. And then the man that he was reincarnated as was named James. When asked some information about his past life, he gave another name called Jack Larson. This was somebody who he was friends with in his past life. He started drawing planes on fire from crashing. He was obsessed with planes, knew everything about him as if he worked on them or flew them. And then he said that his plane was shot down over the water and he died. He would sign his name James 3 because he was the third James. And then it turned out that the James that he was reincarnated from was Junior, so he himself would be the third James. That makes sense. He said that his plane came from a ship called Natoma. So it was like one of those big ships that like carry planes like over the ocean. And his dad bought a book on Iwo Jima and learned that there was a USS Natoma and that the ship had been at Iwo Jima. Jack Larson, who James had mentioned, was on that ship too. And there was only one man who was killed in Iwo Jima on that ship, and that was a man named James Houston. So his parents wound up taking him to a reunion where he met his old family from his old life. They went down to where the plane was shot down for closure. And James says that he still has vivid memories of his ship going down. And that is the end of the docuseries. If you are interested in any of the subject matter, I highly recommend seeing that documentary. It is still on Netflix. It is a Netflix documentary, so it'll probably always be on there. But I would be really interested if anybody stumbles across this podcast and you have had a near-death experience or know somebody who has, or you think that you're reincarnated or know somebody who thinks that they have been. Like I said, my next episode is going to be on my weird visions / night terrors that I used to have. So if you have stories where you wake up and seeing people standing over you, let me know, because I would like to find other people that have experienced that, because nobody in my life that I know personally has ever experienced anything like that. But this has been very long. If you want to see me on Instagram, I have a Beyond Unsolved podcast at Beyond Unsolved. My personal podcast. Beyond Unsolved is my Instagram for this podcast. Same name. And then if you want to see my personal Instagram, which is nothing but a bunch of pictures of my kid, I am at a Matthews 1007. So I will be putting this podcast episode on YouTube. Alexandra Matthews. Is it just Alexandra Matthews, right? Yeah, Alexandra Matthews on YouTube. I'll be putting the video version of these podcasts up. So whether you listen, if you prefer just to listen, I am probably on any podcast platform that you can find. If you want to watch, I can be found on YouTube. So I think that is it, and I will see you in my next episode to talk about my crazy 10-year experience of waking up and seeing people standing over me. Among other things. Among seeing other things. They just stood over me and then disappeared, but that made it sound like they did something else. They didn't do anything else. They were just watching me sleep. Anyway, okay. Till next time.